All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second Conservation Finance Learning Lab, Public Funding, How to Harvest During a Bumper Crop of Federal Funds. This five-part series, for folks who joined us during the first session would know, is meant to cover timely topics with accessible, actionable information and insight for all of your work, including public funding today, the use of debt, our next session, corporate partnerships, and a dolphin tank project workshop. And if you missed our first session on carbon, that recording is available. We're happy to share it. It's also on the website, the Hysted website, I should clarify. Really excited for today's session. I'm Lee Welpton, Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Network. For folks who know us, our fundamental business is to expand people's capacity, confidence, and connection to execute on conservation finance efforts. We try to bridge sectors, and we work to help people find the capital they need to advance the pace and scale of their own efforts. And really, the power of being a network is our ability to bring practitioners together beyond the bounds of individual mission statements and investment strategies or business strategies to align energy and innovation on what matters most. I want to start by sharing a word of thanks to my colleague Jackson Moeller, CFN's chief instigator and project coach, Julia Mettler-Grove, our project and operations maven. We have a new colleague joining us today, Mary Powers, our forest finance associate, who you'll all get to know in good time, we hope. Also want to thank our many partners, colleagues, and friends who are joining us today. And then to share, obviously, a big and generous thank you to Hysted for making this entire series possible, especially Jackie, Jody, Tara, and the entire team. You are one of our closest partners, as you know well, not only on this webinar, but also on our partnership with the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale. So just very much looking forward to facilitating this session and creating some great impact together. Lastly, I just want to share CFN is hiring two new roles, an associate director position, and also a conservation finance fellow, which is an 11-month fellowship, ideally for a recent graduate, that comes with the opportunity for an AmeriCorps stipend. We're also gearing up for our 17th, I did the math, I had to count it twice, our 17th annual Conservation Finance Boot Camp, which will return to the Yale School of Environment this year, June 5th to 9th. Today, the application's open, so we will put a link to that website in the chat for folks who might be interested. Now I'm going to turn things over to Jackie.
Thanks for that introduction, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackie Wrigley, and I'm a conservation finance specialist with Hysted. I'm so pleased to be with you today, and I'm really excited to hear from our panelists. I want to share just a bit about Hysted with you. We are a private operating foundation based in Connecticut and working all around New England and beyond with our partners. We envision a healthier, more livable world for all by working with our partners to conserve the land that sustains us and to steward our natural spaces, resources, and communities thoughtfully and inclusively. I'd also like to thank some people who've been working behind the scenes to bring us together today. I want to thank the entire Hysted team for their guidance and partnership, as well as our panelists and the CFN team for their continued support and collaboration. My final thank you goes to my co-host, Lee Welpton. Lee and her team have been great partners as they lead so many conservation finance programs and opportunities for all of us. And now I'd like to hand it back to Lee for some housekeeping.
Thanks, Jackie. Housekeeping. So general rule, we're using the chat function for all questions folks may have. We can kick things off in just a minute with name and affiliation in the chat for folks who are open to sharing that. As said, this session is being recorded so that we can use it for future distribution. So just keep that in mind. And then also, we're going to keep speaker intros pretty succinct here, but speaker bios are available on the website if you'd like to know a little more about the background and affiliation of our speakers. I believe we just did put that link in the chat, so we should be covered. On to the show. So today we're very, very lucky. We have three close partners and friends who are each respective experts in public policy and funding, federal agencies, and stitching it all together. We hope the content and discussions are useful for your work, and we know many people are very curious to think about how public funding resources can better factor into the pace and scale of each of our efforts. I'll say that just a quick bit of table setting before I hand things over to Tim to get us started. As most folks are probably aware, we're currently witnessing a once in a generation, if not longer, biggest time ever, let's say, public investment in conservation, climate, and community development. There are literally billions of dollars available for conservation, whether from net zero commitments, the permanent authorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, most recently, the Inflation Reduction Act, and also USDA's new Climate Smart Commodities Initiative, among other sources. It's worth noting this level of funding does not have any recent precedent and presumably has an expiration date to get the money out the door. So that's really what the thrust is behind this session. What's at the heart of today's panel? How can conservation practitioners make the most of this windfall? How can organizations better anticipate RFPs and funding and financing opportunities to make sure the best projects, not just the best prepared projects, are considered for funding? How do we make sure this money is not just absorbed on the ground, but also that it goes as far and as fast as possible in addressing climate, biodiversity, human health and equity, and other important considerations? So it's my pleasure to turn things over to our first panelist, Tim Mayle, with the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. And just to note, if you have not seen them, Tim has put out some truly excellent primers on major funding bills, like his top 10 highlights from the Inflation Reduction Act for conservation, which I will pop into the chat as you go here, Tim. So over to you. You were on mute, Tim.
Sorry, folks. I thought I had the technology perfectly set up, but the mute button disappeared when I went to screen share. There we go. Tim Mayle, I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. And our mission is what it shows in this slide, is faster. How do we go faster? And we're particularly interested in how you use policy and policy changes, cultural changes even as part of that, to pick up the pace of conservation action. This was our mission before there was an Inflation Reduction Act or an IIJA. And so it was really more framed around, during the time of typical scarcity that we're all used to, how do we move faster, be more efficient? But it's just as important now, especially for the reason that Lee just said, which is, there is absolutely a ticking clock on the money that we have. And I would say it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, not once in a generation. As far as I know, no one in conservation has seen this much money since 1970 to 1975-ish. And we probably won't see it again for, a really long time. It's just a lot of money. So let me get this going. This is a sort of a quick schematic. I only have a couple of these of all the money that I think is important in the infrastructure bill and the IRA. The x-axis is purely by my own assessment, programs that I think are more focused on water. Y-axis more focused on nature. You could do this any way you wanted, and the circles are all scaled to the amount of money in the programs. So you see lead pipe replacement for water over in the corner furthest towards water. 15 billion is the size of that circle, and Chesapeake Bay up in the upper corner, 238 million. So there's just a lot of money on this slide. I know Kari is going to talk a little later. The tan bubbles are all the USDA, including National Forest Service accounts. Yellow is Department of Transportation. Pale green, or whatever that color is EPA, or actually more chartreusey green is EPA, and light green is Department of Interior. Many of these programs have been around for a while, but they're getting historically more funding. And then a whole bunch of them are completely new programs that agencies are struggling to figure out how to implement at the same time that they are, asking you all to submit proposals. And I think the most likely reality is that we leave money on the table, that we collectively across the NGO space, the finance space, the agency space, we prove that we're actually not up to the task, that we can't figure out how to spend this much money in 5 years on conservation, environment, and climate. But we should try, right? And this call is about helping you all try. Just quickly, these are the programs that our team at Epic is most focused on. Everybody, to some extent has some things that are more relevant to your mission or your work. But those are the ones that so far, at least, have evolved for us as being the things that we're focused on. So both Department of Transportation, EPA, and USDA, really less so for us on Department of Interior programs. I mentioned that the money can also go away, and this is just a recent example. Just before Christmas, Congress passed the big appropriations bill. The deal cut, was it a Friday? I think it was Friday, just before the holiday week. And 25 states lost money from their water infrastructure fund, their state revolving loan fund. Tennessee did the worst, but the 25-ish states in pink on this map are all states that lost money because of earmarking, mostly to the benefit of Alaska and California, which is often the case with earmarks. And it's just an example of how some of this could play out with conservation dollars going in other directions. Although this is at least water infrastructure money going to other water infrastructure projects. I mentioned policy, and so while getting into the discussion of some of these programs, I wanted to describe something that we worked on, which was a state law in Maryland called the Conservation Finance Act, that really laid the groundwork for a lot of the programs that are now coming to pass in one state, in Maryland. The first thing on here, the bill authorized loan guarantees for nonprofits. So nonprofits can use, and actually just today, Maryland announced the very first loan guarantee in its history for a nonprofit, a land protection, a forest management partnership around carbon. Only 3, I think, in EPA's in the 30-year history of the program nationally. Maryland's first one, but a loan guarantee basically so that a nonprofit can borrow money to do more work than they would otherwise have funding to pay for. Loan guarantees are a great example of something that would allow all of our organizations to quickly ramp up capacity so that we could be better able to spend the much greater pots of money available in all these grant programs. But these are a list of things from an equity focused programs to allowing multi-year, multi-million dollar proposals that were part of this legislation that really has set up at least one state to be better able to spend larger amounts of money. And just one example of that is the ability the language that makes green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, nature-based infrastructure co-equal to gray infrastructure as a financing target for a number of big programs in Maryland. So that the direction from the legislature is make nature as easy to finance as roads and buildings. One of the key parts of these programs, and you probably are all aware of it to some extent, is how baffling the process, the information, the availability of information can be. Just today, the Milken Center released a new community infrastructure center effort. So that's the part of the slide, at least on my left side of my screen. The screenshot on the right is from a Michigan-focused effort to help cities and towns, water utilities, and nonprofits get access to the water infrastructure money in bill. But what these both reflect is that these programs are complicated, and there are people, organizations who can help others access it. That's especially relevant for disadvantaged communities, but it's also relevant for any small or medium-sized group. Pretty much anybody other than the Nature Conservancy, for example, who just doesn't have capacity to pay attention to 20 or 30 of those programs. And even the Nature Conservancy, I know, is tapped out in terms of doing that. So the idea behind these kind of structures is that a smaller subset of individuals will focus on being really expert in these programs and what it takes to apply and how to put together proposals. And then they'll provide services to lots of other organizations to access the money. So the first thing I just wanted to emphasize is don't become an expert in something you don't have to be an expert in, because one of the things that happens when we have more money as opposed to when we're competing for less money is that we need to figure out how to share and subdivide the work. At our organization at Epic, specifically what we've done and our flavor of trying to help others access this funding is something called the Funding Navigator. And these slides are focused on water utilities, but it's more relevant to other nature-based infrastructure projects as well. We're basically trying to target communities and utilities who haven't secured funding before. We're trying to bring in either our own or outside experts, and I have some even more complicated slides in the next two showing that, who can help quickly figure out, what are the highest priority projects, then, match up the projects that the communities or the utilities want to build with engineering firms or whomever can help really develop those into fully fleshed out proposals and plans, so that they're eligible for applying for these federal funds, that they can get, applications in. And there's versions of this. Those two slides I just showed are two other versions of this. There's lots of other examples of organizations doing this. And there's more needed. There's more capacity like this needed to just help people access the funding, and even for agencies themselves to understand, how to do that. These are the partner organizations that we're working with, a subset of them. These are the sort of bigger partnership organizations. Those are the states that we're focused on. But across the country, we need these kind of intermediaries that just help make the programs more accessible to more organizations. The same kind of thing needs to be replicated in more places by partner organizations that you work with, or by your own organizations, just to basically help subdivide the task of understanding how to access these funds. For us, what the process looks like in working with a community or a utility or a partner organization, a nonprofit, is something like this, where we have these sort of steps that we walk through, with them in order to get to an application. Sometimes these are $100 million funding applications. And this is a messier version of what that looks like, with the acronyms being all the different kinds of organizations that might be relevant at different steps in this technical assistance process. This process is associated with those basically three programs that have $50 billion of water infrastructure funding. So it's going to make more sense to have more capacity in a context where there's $50 billion than it is, for example, with the $200 of Chesapeake Bay money. But some version of this is needed across the country for so many different resource issues. And then the slide I want to finish on and just spend a little bit of time on is, to me, that these are some of the lessons that we have to take to heart right now, or already should have. Hopefully, some of you have, to be able to tap into this money. So bigger, we have to do bigger projects. It's just, and I'm sure Lee and the folks at Highstead, you all have organized meetings and presentations with people from the private sector who they just can't make a $1 million investment. It's just too small. There's the labor, the administrative expense of doing the work is just too big. That same issue is going to be true for some of these federal programs. They just need bigger projects to be able to get the money done. So either find bigger projects or package together a series of projects that you seek funding for all at the same time. I already covered the second point there in terms of, only be an expert on things that you're really going to spend a lot of time on. If you're only applying to a program once in 3 or 4 years, figure out who else can help you understand it and just listen to them, just follow their instruction, find partners like that. We have to figure out how to get the money spent faster. Contracting, we've been in 18-month processes after awards are announced, trying to get the money actually to the project. I'm sure many of you have the same stories, whether it's on easement projects or cost share programs, that kind of timeline. We run out of time with this money if we have to wait that long to get every project and every contract spent, but everybody can play a role in speeding it up. Multi-year funding proposals, a lot of the policy on these programs is unwritten or is flexible because agencies are going to be so desperate to get projects. So really look at ways to set up, multi-year initiatives. And I'll just give one example for the state revolving loan funds, those big water programs. A number of states have basically a standing queue with some cities, like the city of Baltimore, where they know they're going to submit a new application for a new loan every year, and they've got like an evolving capital improvement plan that just gets teed up for more money every year. our conservation organizations need to think about taking that approach for some of these programs as well. Instead of thinking about it as, this is my one chance to get money and the agency's going to turn me away next year because they have to go to somebody else, you should be thinking about how you can get a more reliable stream of money from some of these programs. I have found, and maybe this is not true, this is certainly not true universally, but state agencies don't understand how much conservation organizations really can do in terms of delivering all aspects of a program on the ground. And there are going to be a lot of state agencies that don't want to hear that and don't want to give up control. The same is true for federal partners. But where you have a willing partner who's willing to sort of let go of some of the small tasks in terms of getting money into contract and then getting contract money out into projects, help them like let go of tasks so that you can do that work. Think about borrowing. I use the example of the loan guarantee at the beginning of a Maryland organization borrowing money. Think about how to borrow money from donors so you can expand staff, so you can get a head start on the projects that you want to do. Basically, just take a risk that you're going to get some of this money from some of these programs in the near future, and make sure you hire staff who are doing tasks that will fit with something that's reimbursable or grant eligible. And lastly, don't compete with the private sector. Conservation is increasingly scaling up, and there are more and more organizations that we work with, and sometimes nonprofits contract to, that can do amazing projects at scale with a real focus on speed and efficiency. And we shouldn't be competing with for-profits that are in the space with us. Let them do what they're good at, and have nonprofits do things that they're not good at. And lastly, there's a picture of our team members, although there's two new ones that just started today. So I don't have their pictures on the slide. And as Lee mentioned at her start, an open position, we have an open position for a senior advisor for conservation and infrastructure finance. So there's a quick link to that position that just came online today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I think it's a really good reminder, all of the lessons learned, but the needing bigger projects. We recently encountered this one ourselves. Don't go in for one project and then come back for a second and then a third project. Go in with the whole kit and caboodle, because it's going to be much easier to due diligence the package. It'll be cheaper, it'll be faster. The funder, in this case, a state finance authority, wants to get the money out in big tranches. They don't want to be considering small one-offs. And also, I think for folks listening in, if you've had an unsuccessful project, you've gotten some insight on what could make it more competitive for a particular funding source. A number of the programs that a lot of us work with are being expanded. Some are new. In either case, we have reason to believe that the first year of funding opportunities, folks are really going to be looking for some, I don't want to call it low-hanging fruit, trusted, known types of entities to get the money out the door, to start to get the money out the door as quickly as possible. Especially as additional criteria and additional project types are being considered for those programs. So talk to your partners and see what's out there. Also, resources to help access funds. Such a good point, Tim. Not many of us have large government affairs teams that are helping us to anticipate funding opportunities. So do take advantage of other resources that can help you better anticipate RFPs, better do some of the initial project development or proposal development. Now we're going to pass things over to Kari Cohen with the Natural Resource Defense Council. Sorry, Kari. Natural Resource Conservation Service, who's got plenty to tell us about some of NRCS's programs. Thanks, Kari.
Thank you. For as long as she lived, my mother always thought I worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council. So thank you so much for being here, everybody. And thanks to Conservation Finance Network and to Highstead for having me. As Lee said there, I work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We're a private lands conservation agency at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In Tim's circle chart there, he pointed out that we have quite a few large circles at NRCS and the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to talk about really just one of them that were on there, but two programs in general. I'm the projects branch chief here at NRCS. And most of our Farm Bill funding at NRCS actually goes directly to landowners, private landowners, and agricultural producers, farmers, ranchers, forest landowners. My programs that I help manage here at the national level are a little bit unique in that the money generally flows through or in collaboration with partners before it gets out on the ground. And so because they're partner-based, a lot of the entities that I'm sure are on the phone today are eligible to apply. And that's why I'm going to kind of focus my remarks on the programs that I'm really responsible for here. The programs I'm going to talk about, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, we call it RCPP, and the Conservation Innovation Grants Program, which I'll shorthand as CIG. We have a history of funding progressive conservation approaches through both of these programs. Specifically with Conservation Innovation Grants, we funded quite a few conservation finance projects through the years, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And through RCPP, we started funding some pay for performance and other progressive financial approaches in recent years. Let me spend a couple minutes on Conservation Innovation Grants, or CIG. It's a much smaller piece of the pie here, and it's actually part of one of those big blobs that Tim showed. CIG was first authorized in the 2002 Farm Bill, so that's quite a few Farm Bills ago now. And CIG supports the development of innovative or new conservation approaches and technologies on private lands. I mentioned conservation finance. Since 2015, we funded upwards of about 40 or 45 conservation finance projects, doing really interesting stuff on private lands. So it's a really good potential source of funding. The priorities for that program do change each year. So it really depends on what's happening year over year. And in FY23, fiscal year 23 here, we're scheduled to release the next national funding announcements for CIG in the spring. Historically, we've been doing about $40 million a year for our national CIG competitions. But one of the CIG components, called on-farm trials, did receive a small bump in the Inflation Reduction Act, going from 25 million to 50. So CIG will be spending more money in FY23. But I wanted to spend most of my time today talking about the larger program that my team manages, and that's called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP. We might have some RCPP partners on the line here today. Through RCPP, NRCS co-invests in on-the-ground conservation solutions to what we call local and regional natural resource challenges. So we're trying to solve problems here. And it's not just NRCS investing in these areas. We're really looking for places where there's already an existing partnership, or there's a new partnership starting up where we're all sort of co-investing in the same places. Eligible partners for RCPP include state agencies. We have many state agencies apply, conservation districts, land trusts, because we do a lot of easements, as I'll talk about, nonprofits, irrigation districts, tribes. It really runs the gamut of folks that are interested in private lands conservation. And the unique thing about RCPP when it comes to NRCS conservation programs is that partners can apply to do just about anything that NRCS does through all of its programs, just within this one program. So we can do land management activities, for example, cover crops or manure management, riparian buffers, things that we do through like our EQIP or CSP programs. We even have land rental authority, which is RCPP is the only program at NRCS that has land rental authority, similar to CRP, but generally speaking for shorter terms. We can do easements, both entity held easements and US held easements, working often with land trusts. And also we can even do public works projects, things like small dams for flood control or water supply, to help communities, for example, mitigate impacts of climate change or drought or something like that. So RCPP was first authorized in the 2014 Farm Bill. So it's a relatively new program for our NRCS. It was reauthorized in 2018. And I think for this community, one exciting thing that happened in the 2018 Farm Bill is that for the first time, the RCPP statute included language that supported the funding of innovative conservation finance and pay for performance approaches. So that was exciting. Obviously, we're coming to the end of the 2018 Farm Bill cycle. It'll be interesting to see what happens next time around with respect to those sort of innovative finance approaches in RCPP. RCPP has two distinct program components. One's called RCPP Classic, and that's been around since the 2014 Farm Bill. And we also have this thing called alternative funding arrangements. RCPP Classic is where partners come to us with a proposal and they say, hey, NRCS, we want you to spend your money in this place and on this resource concern or resource concerns, and generally in this way, whether it's easements or land management activities. But through Classic, most of the money flows through NRCS contracts and easements to landowners or producers. Through the second component, those alternative funding arrangements, or AFAs as we call them, the money generally flows from NRCS to a lead partner. And that lead partner is wholly responsible, either by themselves or most of the time working with other partners or third parties. They're responsible for providing all the assistance for that project to landowners and producers, whether it's technical assistance like conservation planning or practice design. And they also have to have a way to provide funding to producers as well. Now, last year in August, we introduced the first small RCPP grants offering, which was the first time that a grant specifically has been offered through RCPP. And it's likely that in the future, our grants portfolio will grow. I will say that for RCPP, it's there's some challenges to doing grants, and really, regardless of how we disperse funding through RCPP, it's never really going to look like a conservation innovation grant, for example, or maybe it's a grant program that other folks are familiar with. Because even for these partner-led projects where the partner is really wholly responsible for doing the conservation, right now the RCPP statute's written in such a way that partners must deliver conservation pretty much the same way as NRCS would. That's kind of, if you really look at the statute and you kind of understand what it says, it's basically saying we can do RCPP through NRCS, or partners can do it kind of subbing in for NRCS. And so it's not a situation where it's like, hey, the Nature Conservancy or the Iowa Department of Agriculture has a great idea and we're just going to give them money to go and do it. There's lots of strings attached, at least with the way that the current statute is written. At the moment, we've got about 400 active projects in RCPP. And right now we've got a pretty small number of which are incorporating sort of conservation finance and pay for performance approaches. Notable among these is a project called the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, which is operating a pay for performance RCPP project in the Midwest. And we're very excited for them because they recently graduated from RCPP to the big leagues. They got a very large Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities grant that the USDA announced last summer. There's another really cool pay for performance project underway in the Lake Champlain watershed up in Vermont, where project partners are seeking to reduce phosphorus loading there in the Lake Champlain area. Switching gears a little bit here to what's happening now and in the future for RCPP. Under the 2018 Farm Bill, we've had about $300 million a year to expend or to award to projects. The FY23 funding announcements are scheduled for release in the coming months. Part of why I don't have any slides today is because we've been working very hard over the last few weeks to try and get those funding announcements in shape. This is the final year of the Farm Bill, as I mentioned. We're sort of at an inflection point because usually at this point of the Farm Bill, we're all sort of running around thinking about how to improve the program and maybe thinking about ways that we can influence, the next statute, the next version of RCPP in the Farm Bill. And we were doing that, internally we were thinking about how to improve the program and what we can do to streamline it. And then all of a sudden last August, we were hit with this great opportunity through the Inflation Reduction Act, where we are scheduled to receive for our CPP almost $5 billion. Starting this year, we already actually have $250 million in hand. That was the first year for our IRA funding. And all the way out to FY26, when it balloons to $2.4 billion. So, Tim mentioned there's a lot of money in the system, and that is true for us. Although, even though it's coming to us, at least currently scheduled to come to us through FY26, we have the money until 2031. We're not allowed to spend a dime of it after September of 2031, but even if the money comes to us FY23 through 26, we at least can keep working on spending it through 2031 with our partners. Right now, we're working on, again, the details on how to start offering this funding to partners. I mentioned grants. That'll probably be a key feature of our offerings going forward. We have some substantive challenges with spending $5 billion, at least awarding $5 billion over the course of 5 years. As I mentioned, we're sort of at the end of a farm bill cycle, so we funded a lot of partners over the last 4 or 5 years. We're also facing competition. I mentioned the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities effort. That's another USDA initiative where they spent or awarded over $3 billion in a single year. And a lot of those projects look a lot like our CPP projects. And although I know there's lots of folks who were not able to get any of that funding and may come in for our CPP in the future, a lot of our partners did get that funding last year. The one thing that we are really targeting moving forward is the easements community, partially because the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities effort did not include easements. And so we're hoping that the easements community will come in with some great proposals in the next few years. We also know that, like Tim and Lee mentioned, there is just a lot of other funding out there that is attracting attention and interest from partners. And so, we've got to compete with all of our other agencies for people's eyeballs. We know that we need more carrots and fewer sticks to attract the number of proposals that we need to be able to award $5 billion over the next few years if the money comes to us as scheduled. So Lee, I understand that I'm getting a little bit short on time. I was going to have a few remarks about how to submit a great RCPP proposal and some of the things that we see, but maybe just in the interest of time, I'll table that, and maybe some of our questions can get at that.
Well, Kari, I think there's probably great interest in like a tip, trick, or two, some insight from you on, if you had 1 or 2 pieces of advice to give for folks who are interested in accessing some type of NRCS funding for projects. The $5 billion, flashing banner at the top of your presentation here is, I'm sure, pretty enticing to folks who've got a real need.
Well, I would say the number one thing is gaining familiarity with how NRCS conservation programs and practices and processes work, right? When we see proposals that mention NRCS conservation practice standards or even the code of the standard, oh man, we get very excited and start doing a little dance. And that's because, as we have seen in the past, and as I mentioned earlier, the program is just sort of geared around, even if it's a partner-led project, it's geared around doing conservation the way that NRCS does it. And so those partners that, if they're new to NRCS, taking a crash course with their their state RCPP coordinator, getting in league with them, stress testing their ideas with their state coordinators is a really, really good way to improve proposals. And then the other thing, I had a note here that I wanted to say, I don't want to forget it. Oh yeah. For those partner-led projects like grants or AFAs, just making sure that the partnership has the capacity and the capability to deliver conservation, to do the technical assistance with producers and landowners, to be able to write a contract with a landowner. Showing that in your proposal is really key because we are entrusting our lead partners in RCPP with so much for those partner-led projects that those partners that can really do it or have the partnership to do it, they're going to shine through the evaluation process.
Thanks, Kari. And you mentioned something that I just want to double down on, stress testing ideas with state coordinators. It's a really good reminder for folks to start strengthening your relationship with your state NRCS staff yesterday. And Kari, I wonder if you could comment on the number of SIGs or RCPPs that you've funded without an endorsement or support from your state conservation.
Very few. I would probably still not be in this job if I tried to ram a whole bunch of projects into states that don't support them. You know, we work with our state conservationists when they have concerns about projects. You know, sometimes there are, you know, who knows, personality things, or for whatever reason, a state conservationist may not like X, Y, or Z, even though it's, you know, might be a really good conservation project. So it's not a death knell if a state conservationist or a state staff aren't big on a project, but definitely helps if you have the support of your state RCPP and state NRCS staff.
And taking a page out of the bigger NGO's book, and as you said, stress testing, you know, going with your project idea and really hearing what questions your state conservationist has about your project. I'd say that's probably, in our experience, the #1 differentiator between a really strong proposal and one that maybe doesn't get funding.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, I will reiterate, there's going to be a lot of money in the system. I encourage folks to start putting your partnerships together now, because you know, there's never been a better time to get an RCPP award. So thanks so much.
And then one question from the chat before we move on to Shelby. Obviously, match is just a tiny, small issue that a lot of us have to encounter in getting you these nice, sparkly proposals. Will there be any flexibility in RCPP match requirements, especially for easements, to increase the likelihood of helping you get those funds out the door?
Thanks for that question, Dan. There's sorts of, it's a bit of a nuanced question because there's the issue of match, or what we call partner contributions for the project writ large. And on that, we're definitely looking at ways to maybe ease things up, sort of walking down the same trail that was blazed by the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities effort, where there was no required match, but certainly match was considered as part of the evaluation criteria. When it comes to easements themselves, there's often a match requirement for entity-held easements at NRCS. I can't speak right now to our plans because we don't have anything finalized yet, but it's certainly something that we're looking at, is, again, increasing the number of carrots that are available to our applicants.
Thanks, Kari. And we're going to pass things over now to Shelby Sims. Shelby, you want to take it away?
Great. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Kari and Tim, for your remarks so far and the opportunity to share a little bit about myself, Trust for Public Land, and how an organization like us, which some of you may or may not be familiar with already, is looking at this moment in time based on the type of work that we do within our conservation and parks portfolio. So I'm going to share my screen here. And dive right in. By way of intro, my role here at the Trust for Public Land is serving in a capacity as the regional director for New England, which includes our work basically in Massachusetts and north. And I'm, thrilled to bring a little bit of the expertise of, field practitioner and a land trust kind of mindset to this public funding environment that we're talking about. So let's see a little bit about the Trust for Public Land, though, for those of you who might not be familiar with us. We are a national organization with a mission to create parks and protect land for people, and in doing so, ensuring healthy, livable communities for generations to come. We understand that access to the outdoors is a fundamental human need and essential to our health and well-being, and that communities that place a high value on outdoor access are healthier, more resilient, and ready for the changes coming from a climate perspective, and more equitable. And I and I start there on some level, not just to introduce you all to kind of the organization of the Trust for Public Land at this moment in time, but to understand that every one of us as nonprofit mission delivery organizations within the natural resource domain has a mission and a differentiation that we are trying to match with the opportunities at hand with this kind of somewhat unprecedented federal funding. And so the task for all of us is matching the landscape of available funding sources with our specific contribution, be it a geographic one, an issue area one. And so this is just sort of the lens through which we approach a lot of the diverse array of funding sources that we navigate and bring to bear at the community level with the specific mission delivery. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and during that time period, we've completed over 5,000 projects and leveraged public funding on the order of $85+ billion to conserve land and create parks and communities across the country. In New England, which is the area that I really lead our teams, we are looking at a handful of outdoor equity gaps that we really want to be moving the needle on right now, including the fact that 1 out of every 5 children in New England, this is northern New England, don't have close to home access to the outdoors, that our region's anticipated to lose 1.2 million acres of forest and upwards of approaching 20% of our carbon storage capacity in the region. Roughly 34% of regional schools lack walkable park and open space in their community nodes, and less than about 1% of lands in this region are formally stewarded by Indigenous tribal communities. And 72% of trails within this region are actually located on private lands with uncertain futures in an era of fragmenting forest. So with that said, I wanted to kind of spotlight a couple of case examples, and these are projects that we're either actively working on now or have happened in the past that are all projects that are a little bit smaller in scale. So we've been thinking and talking really big in the context of how do we show up in this moment for this huge bolus of federal funding that we need to put to work. But I have a couple of examples here and just sort of an exploration of our funding stack that I wanted to walk through that are actually kind of smaller projects, just to remind ourselves that as much as we need to be moving faster and bundling things, that there actually is a role for federal programs to play at the community level, and projects that aren't necessarily the largest projects that your organization has ever undertaken, just to kind of offer a counterpoint. So this is a photo from a project we're working on in central western Vermont called Otter Creek. This is a project, it's at almost 200 acres that will be conserving several miles of frontage of the Otter Creek, which is one of Vermont's longest rivers and is a really important upstream flood protection and resiliency wetland area in this location in particular for downstream communities, including Wallingford, Middlebury, and downstream communities. And so this is a project we've actually identified a partnership with new takeout partners for us of the State Wildlife Agency as a takeout partner and a local rivers conservancy as a project partner. We layered 3 different public funding sources, and you can see sort of amounts and required lead time in these to work on acquiring the property, undertake some of our hard and our soft costs. And so I think one of the key takeaways on this thumbnail of a project was keeping an open mind when considering new project partners. And this moment in time, whether it's pursuing an RCPP project for the first time or working with a different local, state, or federal partner is, while we may not need to take Tim's advice, may not need to become expert in all these things, we should be drawing new connections with partners, both within the nonprofit community and our public agency partners, whether they're state working with federal funds that are at play or our federal partners as well. Another project we're actively working on right now is in the city of Portland, Maine. This is the North Deering Park, a 20-acre park. that is going to advance park equity and an underserved part of the city of Portland and bring a 10-minute walk to a park of over 2,000 Portland residents who currently don't have that, along with a walking distance of 2 local schools. This is a project, you can see the funding stack here, some of the lead times on these resources. This is a project, though, where we really anchored our funding source around a first-time use program for our local team in New England with the Trust for Public Land. And this is the Federal Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership. So a takeaway there for us is that, and you'll see this again, being a guinea pig on a new funding source has pros and cons. So this was the first ORLP grant in the state of Maine, and the first one that our office had worked with. Really long timelines. This is not a program, this is a program that's received a lot of support through the Great American Outdoors Act, and not necessarily IRA or the some of the other legislative developments that have been mentioned on the call so far, but is a really important one when we think about parks, park funding, and work that you may or may not be doing in more densely populated areas. So another project we've been working on is the Talking Brook Public Lands. This is essentially a new state park in southern Maine, a several 100-acre project using an array again of state and federal funding sources. The takeaway I'd like to offer here on this one is that is the point actually that I think Lee, you introduced, which is really inviting input early, really before, as you're shaping your funding public funding strategy, about where there's going to be a match to kind of chart the plan. We ended up eliminating a few potential public funding sources based on feedback early on in the project, but did proceed with a Land for Maine's Future and an LWCF stateside, which is a program that supports a lot of public recreation that folks on the line have maybe worked with, and it's a great program. And last but not least, I wanted to share a story. This is a past project of ours in central Vermont as well, called the Huntington Community Forest. This was, again, a small community-based project, a neat kind of open, a wonderful kind of outdoor classroom story of a co-located community forest with a local elementary school that had long hosted its outdoor programming for that elementary school on a privately held property adjacent. Through our work with the town, the community forest program, state funding, and also the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund as administered in the state of Vermont, we supported the acquisition of the property by the town of Huntington. Again, being the guinea pig for a new funding source has its pros and cons. This project generated the first example of a town acquisition of land using state revolving loan fund. Not only did the town actually apply for a loan for the project, but the loan was specifically pursued for the loan forgiveness portion that could feed in as a essentially grant capital funding for the project on the order of $300,000, as you see on the line. So that's been a really wonderful case point. We're eagerly trying to replicate another municipal project of this sort because as you've seen, I think on Tim's slides, this has been, I think, within our, broadly speaking, the land conservation community sector. I think there's been a lot of talk about how we put to work the state revolving loan funds and not a ton of examples. And so we, I think as a sector, really need to unite around best practice sharing and really kind of putting the heat on some of our state partners to kind of to demonstrate demand that we can put this money to work. So I just wanted to underscore really the fact that this is a time like no other. I mean, within this generation, the Trust for Public Land is really, really, really closely watching and trying to shape and understand the opportunities within $10 billion worth of programs within the Inflation Reduction Act. I think from a standpoint of forest conservation within New England, which is something we focus on a lot in my shop, we are watching closely the $700 million forest legacy sort of increase within that bill. But we're also really interested in understanding some of the opportunities that DOI support for tribal climate resilience work might create, and urban and community forestry opportunities, among many others. And then additionally, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which maybe you're hearing about a little bit less than the Inflation Reduction Act, also creates a lot of opportunities. $23 billion for, as I mentioned, the clean water SRFs, clean and drinking water SRF programs, the coastal estuary and land conservation program is another that I think that the exact funding amounts are still being determined, but we're watching quite closely. And then I kind of wanted to just even step back for a moment and support the thinking that I know that you all are doing, and share by way of example, kind of share where we're thinking about this. We, I think the advent of these significant funding flows creates an opportunity for our sector and our organizations to really think and act big, and to kind of chase the opportunities that maybe have long been on the horizon, or kind of wrestle down the landowners that have been holdouts. And I just wanted to share by way of example an announcement we made last week on significant acreage in Maine. And this has been a bit of a leap in the net will appear, although a calculated risk assessment perspective from ours, but one where, if not for this significant federal funding opportunity, we may not have made a decision to acquire land in Maine, almost 31,000 acres, with a to be determined game plan on how we're going to pursue that. And maybe as a teaser for the next webinar on the docket in this series, we did rely on this particular project example. We did rely on philanthropic partners with program related investment and kind of debt tools to bridge the moment in time that we wanted to act on this particular piece of property in Maine, and the future funding flows that we sort of fundamentally believe will support the acquisition down the line. And so I wanted to underscore, this is my last slide here, a couple of things building on that, which is, this is the time to think big. And so to the degree that we can be cultivating that, not only our board, our staff, and our donor base, to sort of say the moment is now for us to kind of chase the dream and to the dreams and the vision that we've been cultivating. I think that this is a great opportunity. The other piece is that I think it's important, as we've heard so far on the call, not to be overwhelmed and to reach out to partners who maybe have a specialty area. I mean, and I'd be remiss not to encourage folks where there's mission alignment to talk with us at the Trust for Public Land, where we do take pride in understanding a certain degree of the landscape of federal funding. And we are coming up to speed pretty quickly on some others, including transportation, things that relate to recreation, access, trails, and that sort of thing. And then, yeah, I think this is an exciting moment in time. So we should all feel affirmed that our work is being listened to, and the mandate is upon us to kind of put this money to work in a meaningful way. So back to you, Lee.
Thanks, Shelby. Especially important thinking about not just kind of keeping an open mind for conservation project partners, but TPL really excels at community partners, health partners, et cetera. You mentioned transportation funding as well. So I think it's a good reminder to folks to really think broadly about who the stakeholders are, who benefit from the types of projects and initiatives and outcomes that are truthfully, they're big impacts and outcomes from our work.
Yeah, and I'm keeping this slide up here, not by accident. So I did want to give a shout out for folks. There was a TPL hosted webinar actually coincident with this one that really narrows in on park equity. So if that's an interest area for any of the listeners on this, I'd encourage folks, there's going to be a posted recording of it that has kind of a special focus area. So that'll be on our website. The link is at the bottom of the slide.
Thanks, Shelby. And we are going to invite Tim back. Tim, you're here somewhere. Yep. And just a reminder to folks to please put your questions in the chat, and we will kind of proceed in the order that they are received, and also the potential benefit that they may have for your fellow audience members. But I wanted to just start off with something we haven't touched on explicitly yet today, and that is Justice 40. Which, for folks who know, was created to confront and address decades of underinvestment in disadvantaged communities. So just wanted to start off the panel discussion, Tim and Shelby, how are either of you seeing Justice 40 creating opportunities for smaller and historically underserved producers and landowners? I know Kari had a perspective on this and had to run, but Tim, maybe you care to comment.
I mean, there's just a lot of money available right now for disadvantaged communities and environmental justice communities. The challenge, as I alluded to in my remarks, is that technical assistance to help them, get ready for it. I was just talking to somebody yesterday about a city that is just tapped out, like they're applying for one set of monies for things they have to do, and they don't feel like they can apply for money for something they want to do, even though it's grant money, and in this case doesn't have a match requirement, right? So like, that's just a really hard part of the challenge. But I'd rather have that problem than not having, the funding. And we're going to see more and more of it roll out, more and more really generous, full grant, 100% grant programs from USDA for producers, for conservation practices, and targeted towards specific communities. I know Shelby, your organization does amazing work on, mapping equity issues and spreading that approach to more states, and having states themselves, as opposed to the federal government, define the areas in which they'll focus dollars and focus incentives in these programs is really a crucial step, because those EJ commitments in the Biden Justice 40 executive order are not permanent, or they might not be permanent. So that's what I'd add. Shelby?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the additional comments that come to mind for me have to do with, and from the perspective of Trust for Public Land, it's often an intermediary and amplifier of community interests, vis-a-vis funding opportunities. I think some of the challenges are, kind of trust building and familiarity, and sort of how that can run crosswise with the urgency, the crisis of urgency. and I think we would all be well advised to, kind of be careful about how much we sort of work from a mindset of urgency, as we're building and deepening those relationships, which isn't to say it's monolithically not appropriate, or it just kind of depends on the relationship, the community. I think there are other kind of practical and implementation challenges and opportunities. Certainly I think that the philanthropic community can really step in to sort of meet some of the match and and other barriers to participation, but those evolutions and relationships are also still taking shape. And so yeah, I mean, those are just some comments. I think I don't spend as much time at the high level kind of policy consideration perspective as I do with the team, thinking about just kind of implementing projects on the ground, and often it's the challenges that folks have raised on the on the question so far, like, well, how do we get over a match barrier that are often the most challenging? And so, yeah, it's a great question though.
Well, and even thinking in terms of potential role philanthropy or others, just the nature of many of these sources of funds are reimbursement grants, which for communities that have cash flow problems, I mean, just, not being able to manage some of the kind of upfront funding needed to get going before that reimbursement comes through. And if anybody on the call who's received federal reimbursement funds knows, each agency has their own timeline for processing your reimbursements. So certainly a lot of challenges to overcome in getting those funds to where they're needed. Shelby, I wonder if we could kind of follow up a little bit on some of the secret sauce that TPL has in how you folks access and track funds. So I wonder if you could speak a little to the systems or tools or processes that help TPL stitch together funding and financing, especially from multiple sources. And you also, if I can throw two questions at you at once, you also mentioned that you're closely watching the Inflation Reduction Act programs. And just what does that mean? How does your shop go about that type of tracking exercise?
Sure. Well, in some ways, the answer is very similar for both. Our special sauce is really related to relationships with local program implementers. So that, like, I would say it's 65 at least % of the equation. The other remainder is something that folks on the line, your shop may or may not have, which is the capacity to staff, a DC kind of conversation. So we have a federal affairs shop, like some other peer organizations, where we, keep track of the, RFP deadlines as they evolve, how programs are being administered, how appropriations for those programs where appropriations is a factor. We build and sustain relationships with the congressional delegation and the agency implementers. So I think with anything, it's the relationship piece. And so I think, to the degree, and Tim, I think your caution is a good one, which is don't become an expert on everything immediately. So source your, added capacity wisely based on where it is that what your project needs, or where the organizational, focus is from an issue area, and spend some time investing in those partnerships and exploring them in the context of this bumper crop that we hope to harvest. On the Inflation Reduction Act side, with I'll take the forest legacy funding as a singular example. I know we have been taking conversations with every one of our state agency partners who administer those funds, to sort of, many of whom are doing listening sessions with partners to say, what does the landscape of opportunity look like? How do we bundle projects to make them? We're in New England often looking at landscapes where we're excited about four-figure acreage projects, and can those compete at a national level to the degree there's competition? And so, kind of brainstorming ways around that, or opportunities to not adjust rules, but to kind of creatively think about what the unique value add is of the New England region, or a particular state's contribution to the national picture. So again, relationships, meetings, like kind of taking a bit, justifying to yourself that time spent is worthwhile in this moment in time, in the challenge of day-to-day time, task, and talent management, I think is something for us all to think about, and maybe branching out, not necessarily to be devoured by the details of federal programs, guidelines, intricacies, but to kind of source that expertise outside of your own organization that could partner and kind of grow your pie strategically.
Absolutely.
If I could just jump in and suggest like an action or a tactical way to like make this real, it's you probably all heard that sentence, like, I know just enough to be dangerous. And often that's a really bad thing. This is like a real moment for that, for learning just enough that you can then like say, could I do this, right? Could I take this approach? Kari was sort of alluding to some examples in his programs. And so what I'd say is, learn just enough about a program to, to figure out like which of my projects might fit that program. And then if you see something that doesn't quite match up with what you want to do, just proactively ask your local office if you can do it, right? Like write that email to that person at the Fish and Wildlife Service office or wherever, whatever program it is. And at the same time, ask somebody like Lee or Shelby or myself or the folks from Highstead, anyone on this call, or any of your other partners, hey, could you help me get this same question to somebody in the regional office or in the national office, right? Because for good reason, folks in field offices they're desperately getting money out the door and they don't know which rules they can break. So you want to get that question to a second person as well, to a Kari Cohen. And so just like, try, right? And especially at the moment where these programs haven't put out guidance yet, you can, if you ask, could I do this? There's a chance that you might be able to get them to change their mind before they even put out guidance and make it possible for you to do it, from day one, right? Like you're asking for permission in advance, and they could say, sure, you can do that. We'll write it into the program documentation.
Well, and Kari's not here to defend himself, so we can absolutely air our grievances against NRCS processes, right? No, but in all seriousness, I wonder if we could speak a little more. This has come up in each of your talks to some extent, but the constraints and also the opportunities. So constraints like match, opportunities like, I don't know, match guarantee, perhaps, which could either, the constraints are making it difficult for on-the-ground groups to pursue funding versus opportunities where groups could really kind of seize the moment to work around and secure those funds. So maybe we'll start with constraints because talking about frustrations is easy. Just wondering, from where we all see it, what's really going to make it difficult for groups to land these funds? Cash flow, match obligations. Shelby, you mentioned, community-based is community-paced, and there's an urgency to get funds out, but we know that it has to be done appropriately with our partnerships and in a trust-based manner.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think, well, I mean, to be honest, I think some of the other, I don't know to what degree it's kind of solvable, within the context of the folks on this phone, but or on the line. But I think I think there's an understanding that the agency administrative capacity needs to grow to get this funding out the door, and we're seeing some of that evolve and be addressed. And kind of eligible funding here is to actually grow footprints of staff, many of whom for decades have been losing staff. So I think that's a really big concern and constraint, and one that even if action is being taken now, there's a lag time of a few years. And Tim, I think you've mentioned again and again, like there's a high likelihood we're going to be leaving money on the table here for a number of reasons, and I have to imagine that that's one of them. Another is, that we're really we tangle with in a significant way is some of the appraisal challenges within some of the Forest Service programs. We're seeing though that documenting and speaking from a somewhat united voice across the conservation community of what the challenges have been has caused some spotlight to be put on opportunities for streamlining and enhancement and risk reduction, especially when it comes to appraisal work. And so the most recent omnibus appropriations bill actually directed the agency of the U.S. Forest Service to really take a look at some of its appraisal protocol. So that's an example where, to the degree we can kind of get on the same page as a practitioner community or communities to say, this is a challenge we're all facing. And no, it's not just one cranky organization that's tripping over itself. There's a lag time with addressing that constraint, but hopefully one that can be addressed before, 2031 that we've got.
I think that's a really good point. And Tim, you can either pile onto that or I can toss another one your way.
Yeah, go for a different one.
All right. So when we talked, it's very much not about just getting the money out the door, but also making sure that it goes as fast and far as possible. Could you speak to how Epic really thinks about or is working in its respective capacity to see leverage come into the equation? Or just opportunities to move faster?
Yeah, I think I'll stick with faster, which is, but it's also efficiency. And one of our team members just did a post today, which I just saw, about the fact that, and for restoration projects, for ecological restoration projects, a third of the budget can be taken up just with permitting and contracting. All the paperwork that Shelby was just talking about in terms of easement appraisals, right? All that work happens before you get to conservation. A third is a lot of money to lose in that process. And it's also the time, right? Like 2 years, 3 years, 4 years sometimes to get a project to, to groundbreaking or to ribbon cutting or whatever the, the moment is. And so we've spent a lot of time talking to agencies about, why they do, what they wish they didn't have to do. Why do they have to do it that way? And, that same kind of conversation with folks in your local offices, your field offices, or regional offices can be really valuable because there may be steps that they're taking that are slowing down your work that they don't realize is as big of a deal for you as it is. The easement and appraisal issues that Shelby was just referencing are unfortunately they have a local component, and there's definitely some ground that people could make up at a local level. But there's also, sort of major national impediments to moving some of those faster. But even there's room to make that, that stuff work better. And we've really been inspired by, the state of California launched a permitting reform effort, environmental permitting reform, by the governor and the natural resource secretary called, cutting green tape. They've adopted a bunch of changes that you just wouldn't think California could do without a backlash, including, not doing their version of a NEPA analysis on a bunch of restoration projects, 150 restoration projects. You've got a permitting dashboard at the federal level that's trying to expedite gray infrastructure projects. We need to figure out how to expedite green infrastructure projects. So I just think there's more work that we could all be doing there to lift up, what's keeping us from getting a project started. I also think we need some different people in conservation, some different skill sets, and some sort of ombudsman like roles and ombudswomen roles to help with some of these administrative challenges. I emphasize the getting the money part, but we also need the getting the permission part too, where there's people who could help play problem-solving roles across our conservation community. And it would really be nice, actually, if I thought about priority hires for agencies, that things I wish that they were doing with the 5 to 10% staffing increases they have authorization for, it would be to hire more effectively project advocates whose job is just to get the Land and Water Conservation Fund dollars out or wildlife crossing money spent or whatever it would be, right? And just having people who are there to deal with your issues, and then they can you don't have to know how to solve it. That's their job.
Questions, project development support. Yeah. The places where a lot of the agency partners have lost a lot of institutional memory, especially in recent years.
There are a couple of sort of situations and comments in the chat that we could turn to if it's the right time. I'm just seeing some ongoing comments.
Seeing a number of comments. One did have a question, so I'll start with that one. Harder to maybe read out people's comments otherwise, because many of them are quite specific to, well, some of them are pretty universal, but one is just on tips for timing. In this instance, land deal, funding for a land deal came through. Fee interest in a parcel was not for fee interest in a parcel, but the funding had to be turned down because the project wasn't far enough along. That's a fairly common issue, I think, just with mismatch of timing and funds. But any tips, and maybe we'll start with you, Shelby, on just thinking about how the timing lines up or doesn't.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think one approach that, I mean, not knowing the specifics of this situation, a more global approach that Trust for Public Land does take, and maybe it's aided by having some access to legal resources. But we do typically, before we take the step of seeking public funding or private funding to a certain degree for projects, we typically like to work under some kind of site control and some kind of binding agreement with a landowner or a purchase and sale agreement that gives us the confidence that we have, a 12, 24, whatever the time frame is, exclusive right to be acquiring the property interest. And that's really a part of our recipe and many organizations' recipes. If it's possible to take that kind of approach, depending on what the legal resources your organization has, that might be one way to reconcile, the funding opportunity with site control.
Thanks, Shelby. And one that came through to Tim, but I think it has a lot of benefits, so we want to ask it broadly. Tim, do you see any effort within the federal programs to streamline or improve their policies and rules for existing programs that are seeing large increases in funding?
Yeah, I mean, one example was right after the IAJA passed, NIFWIF rolled out that big announcement of sort of combined funding. That was a creative effort to basically just to deploy capital, fast and efficiently. And I think with some success, the easement appraisal procedures that we've just been talking about are a second example. My fear is just they go too slowly, and right, we finally solved the problem at the moment that we've spent all the money. So those are a couple of examples. I think that Kari was alluding to some things that NRCS is working on. The challenge is that the agency folks need help, right? They need your support. They need encouraging collaborators from outside saying this would make a difference to us. So I think that's a big part of it, is just creating creating alliances with those folks. I just emailed a state agency, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, to ask a question about an initiative that I learned about that they had started in 2018, I think. And in consequence of them responding to me, they told me about three whole other projects or initiatives that they had funded, including one that was sort of like what I was describing in my slides, was a multi-year effort. So they were giving a new grant every year to the same effort. Predictable, right? Like they knew and I had never heard of it before, right? And like, well, how did you do that? How did you have permission to do that? Why does everybody else apply just for one grant, right? Like that kind of stuff. There's so much opportunity that's just buried or hidden, and you have to find those creative people at state agencies or federal agencies, right, who are willing to say, the Teddy Roosevelt, like, does it say that I can't do it, right? So no. So let's try multi-year, multi-project grants. Let's try to streamline the administrative processes. So I mean, if you like made a an album of your most creative government partners, who would be in that album? And those are the people we should all be calling to try to get money spent. And those are the people who should be running these programs at this moment. The other thing I'd say is just thinking about like at a grant scale, we treat, imagine if the IRS, audited every single taxpayer, right? We sort of take that approach with grants as opposed to doing it like a program audit or an audit at a state level. We like every grant goes through the ringer. And those are conservation partners, usually on both sides, requiring that. We have to figure out a way to extend more trust. And these projects, recognizing there'll be a little bit more waste, just to figure out how to use trust in a different way to just get the money, delivered to projects on the ground.
Yeah, I think it's a good point about like a little bit of waste, a little bit of failure too, in order to get these funds out the door. Some things aren't going to work, and we need to be comfortable with that, and so do the funders, especially. Well, we are coming up against time, so I'm going to ask the last question, which is the magic wand one. Tim Shelby, you have a magic wand, you can wave it, and magically some headache is solved, some rule goes away that allows for funding to come out the door in some way that it currently can't. How would you use your genie wish, if you will?
I actually have I'll cram two into one, but they're the same theme, which is modifying eligibility for a couple of, well, forest legacy, in particular for federally recognized tribes, and the community forest program. I would be interested in expanding eligibility to community-based or community development organizations that may not have conservation within their mission. And I think what we see is a lot of organizations, particularly environmental justice organizations, don't use the word conservation in their charter, but it's certainly, kind of within the mandate and fit of the community forest program. And so just expanding and enhancing eligibility to address themes related to Justice 40, among others.
Thanks, Shelby. Tim?
Yeah, magic wand, I would authorize a dozen programs to be able to just buy environmental outcomes at a fixed price. So whether that's an acre conserved or a pound of nitrogen or an environmental justice or recreation outcome, to just say, when you're completed, this is what we wanted to buy. This is the price we said we'd buy it at. Really no other questions asked than, did you do that? And does the model or the results show that you produced it?
Not surprised by that particular answer there, Tim. Well, hey, folks, thank you so much.
The phrase of green tape on this webinar. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, for sticking with us to the end here. Especially thank you, Shelby. Thank you, Tim. And though he's no longer on the call, thank you, Kari, for sharing your insights, sharing your expertise. For folks who are able to join us, if you're not busy on Valentine's Day, we'll have our next session. And that is part 3, the art and science of borrowing money, bridge loans, and state revolving funds. So continuing through the series on what we think folks really want to learn more about and could benefit from understanding how to access and put to use. So February 14th, 2 p.m. Eastern, we hope to see you. And otherwise, just wishing everyone a great start to their new year, 2023, and we'll see you again next month. Thank you again. Bye.